Hello there, and welcome to this commentary for Return of the Obra Dinn. As always, if you would prefer to watch this walkthrough without me nattering over it, then there will be a link in the description to take you to that video. Without further ado, let's get started in Falmouth, England, 1807.
Company man woke me up. Said you'd need ferry to the Obra Dinn. Not many eager for that job. Seems a bit late if you ask.
I didn't.
What's in the box?
I don't know. I'll hoist it up in a few minutes.
Hey! How?
Carefully.
Now, an interesting tidbit I found with this, as I had to go through it a few times to get this walkthrough right, is during that cutscene there, the voice of the protagonist that you're playing actually changes on subsequent playthroughs, or at least it did for me. I'm not sure if it's a case of it changing once you get to the second playthrough, or if it's slightly randomised whether or not it occurs, but during at least one of my playthroughs, the insurance inspector was voiced by a female rather than a male. I don't think it holds any particular interest other than a nice Easter egg for those who play through it multiple times. Now, straight away you're probably noticing quite unique art aesthetic. I think a big reason for that is that this game was actually made mostly by one person, Lucas Pope,
Oi! It's too heavy!
who, if the name rings a bell, it'll be because the creator of this game was also the one who created Papers, Please, another darling indie title.
It's too heavy. Take it yourself or open it here.
Now, if you haven't played this game before, I would urge you to stop and go and do it, because as a mystery game, you only get to play through it once. Once you know how everything works out and you know all the explanations, there's not a huge amount of replay value, and I would hate to spoil that for you. If it's not your sort of game, then welcome aboard. I trust that you now find yourself aboard the Obra Dinn. I expected this day to come, and my every intention was to tell the ship's strange tale within this page of books. Your presence at the Obra Dinn is critical. I leave the discovery of its fate and the completion of this book in your hands. And that's written by a Henry Evans. That's going to be very critical here. And also when it states that you should where you should post it. So we have the book here, and our goal is to fill it out. We have a map showing the general voyage of the Obra Dinn, as well as schematics of the ship and its various levels. And there's a couple of identities we're only going to be able to figure out with the help of this map. So it's a good idea to get a bit of a read through of that and see where everything is. In addition to that, we have a full manifest of every single crew member. There were 60 people in total, and it's our job to link the name to the face of the individual, how they died, and if necessary, who killed them. Now, this is a sketch written by one of the artists, and for the eagle-eyed players, there's actually already two names you can identify right off the bat. The artist, Mr. E.S., and the helmsman, because of their two very unique roles. You can kind of tell who they are and what they did just from the pictures alone. And you can tell it's the artist because he's not in the picture, he only has his initials. We also have this bargain chapter here. This will be the last chapter we do, and only becomes apparent if we get everything else right. As well as that, the game was very nice to give us a glossary telling us all the different terms, most of which most people should be aware of. What a captain is, what a surgeon is. There's a few others such as midshipman or purser or bosun that might be a little bit more difficult to discern. So this is put in there for those who don't know anything about ship, seafaring, this period in nautical history, such as myself. I had no idea what it was, and especially a midshipman. And for instance, it's very important that you know that midshipmen are basically officers in training, so they tend to be quite young and from a wealthy background. I would have had no idea, because you also have topmen and seamen, and both of those tend to be more of the lower class, more working classes. So it's nice they put that in here. There are some tidbits of information that the game just kind of expects you to know, and there isn't a huge amount to hint towards it other than just general knowledge. Thankfully, those instances are relatively rare, but there are a couple of cases if your general knowledge is lacking, shall we say. Now, the key gameplay element is this, the memento mortem. When we come across a dead body, we get to live out the exact moment that they died in a freeze frame. And it's through that, it's the only way we're going to be able to figure out what's happened here. It's the main gameplay mechanic of the game. It's kind of helpful for someone in our line of work. So let's get started, shall we, with the very first body.
Captain! Open the door! Kick it in. Ah! Lest we break it down and take more than those shells!
You bastards may take exactly what I give you!
So this is the first memory we come across, and we can already tell quite a lot's happening here. So it's important to make a few notes. During the transcript that was being said at the beginning, we heard them state, "Captain, open the door." So, I mean, if you zoom in on this character, you get a portrait of him, and you can see him wearing a captain's uniform. So it should be pretty obvious that this is Captain Robert Witterall, but it's at the start of the game. It's a little bit of a tutorial, so they will literally say his title to help you understand it. In addition to that, we see this other man shot here, and if you zoom in on him and look at the sketch, he's also wearing quite fine clothing, which suggests that he's most likely one of the first, second, third or fourth mates, one of the four mates I should say. He also has quite a thick Scottish accent, and there's only one Scottish mate, so we could probably make an educated guess, but the game doesn't expect you to know that just yet. It's going to give you a few more hints going on, but you could probably identify him this early on. It's probably quite important to get into the right mindset with this. The standards of evidence you achieve are not the standards of evidence that are going to be present in a court of law, or at least not a corrupt one. You're going to have to make a few inferences here and there, a few leaps of logic. And I think it was actually one of the biggest criticisms that Matthew Matosis had. I'll leave a link to his video as well, when he's talking about, for the most part, it relies on deductive logic, but there are a few moments of inductive logic, and it kind of takes away from what the game's going for.
Where are they? Must be in here someplace.
They're at the bottom of the sea.
That's a lie.
So there isn't too much more that can be gleaned from the next two scenes, other than the cause of death. So what it appears to happen is that this individual here has searching for something. What that something is, we don't yet know. And in his search, also make note of this person and the way he moves, that's going to help identify him. But in his search, he's gone to attack the captain. I'm not sure if this is some kind of stick that he's just nudged him with, or if it's some kind of pole arm, but he's gone to either poke or attack or whack or stab the captain in the shoulder, and has received a slit throat in retaliation, in self-defense. And this is, I'm not too well versed in different kind of murder mystery games, but this is something that this one in particular does exceptionally, is telling the story through a natural gameplay mechanic. That being of trying to uncover what's going on, and through little bits you figure out the story of the Obra Dinn. That's something that definitive answers will not always be available, which is another way of saying it's not always deductive reasoning. I mean, if everything was deductive reasoning, the game would probably be too easy. Because I'd like to think most individuals aren't that stupid, and especially the kind of individuals who would be interested in playing a game like this are probably quite attentive and quite have a mindset for figuring these kind of things out. So they had to throw a few curveballs, especially later on. So here we see the person before who was climbing down from the deck above, which gives a quite a clear indication of the kind of role that he has, the fact that he's that athletic, the fact that he can clamber around so quickly. Has tried to sneak up, well, has successfully snuck up on the captain and stabbed him in the flank. And in retaliation for said stabbing, he has gotten a club to the face. And I have to admire the sheer strength of the captain, that this one club is enough to kill him. I mean, maybe following it, because we don't see in the memory, maybe he did hit him a few more times, but it seems that this one straight solid strike was enough to crack the skull and kill the individual. So he's been killed by being clubbed to death by the captain. It's actually a mistake I make, and you'll see in a second. I put that he was stabbed because I had to do this whole thing in one playthrough and I made a couple of mistakes, and I actually don't notice until near the end of the walkthrough. It kind of messes me up a little bit because the game kind of identifies it in triplets, and I'll explain that shortly. And so for the longest time I was trying to think, why is this not unlocking? What have I done wrong? What have I done wrong? And yeah, if you do something simple, it won't unlock. And the game has this kind of triplet unlocking mechanism where every time you get 3 deaths correctly, or guess them correctly I should say, it will unlock all of them. And it's to stop you from just brute forcing your way through, but also give you a little bit of a hint.
Abigail, your brother, my friend, I shot him dead. I'll be with you soon, my love. Please forgive me for everything.
So that's quite definitive, and there's a huge amount of information we get here. First of all, the captain has committed suicide. Death by heart shoot. Suicide by flintlock pistol. And he's also identified the person in the bed. I mean, he says my love, and in actual fact, if you look in the manifest, they both have the same surname of Witterall. So we can safely deduce that that woman is the captain's wife. Another interesting thing is that he says, I shot your brother. This individual here with the tomahawk. Now, we already had a fairly educated guess in the fact that he was most likely one of the 4 mates, and he spoke with a thick Scottish accent. But we have definitive proof now. There's only 4 women on the ship. Abigail is one of the names, and so we can identify that she's Abigail because the captain said. But Abigail is also Scottish, and if you know anything about naming conventions, you will find that Abigail actually has a middle name, the maiden name as it's called. So her surname was changed to be Witterall because she married the captain, but her maiden name is the surname she would have had previously. And you will find that the first mate has the same last name as Abigail's maiden name, and that's how you meant to identify them. It's also a case that you could just say that they're both Scottish, because there's not many Scottish people on there, but they both have the surname of Huscott. And that's how you're meant to definitively identify these people. We don't know how she died yet. She's lying in bed, so either she died of an illness or an injury, and she was put there post-mortem. But we can at least identify their identities. So at the end of every one of these memories, we'll have a number of crosses, which will say how many fates were determined in this instance. Now, the memories will play out chronologically once they start, with one exception. So, we've gone from a typical murder mystery to some Cthulhu-esque shit happening quite quickly. Make a good note of the characters here, because there's actually quite a few fates that occur here that we won't get definitive proof of, because a lot of them are pulled overboard, so we won't see their bodies. So we've seen that Abigail's fallen, and the person next to her, the one she was most likely speaking to, is this Martin. We see the helmsman, because of where he's standing in the sketch, being pulled up by a tentacle, so he was most likely killed by the Kraken. And we see these two women here. One is wearing a wedding ring and one's not. If you go into the crew manifest, you will see also one more person being pulled off there. I should have mentioned that. A Chinese man of some description. So a lot of people die here, even though there's only one body. So if you look into the crew manifest, after Abigail's been identified, you will see that there are 3 other women. One of them is a Formosan, meaning that she is not of European descent. So of those 2 remaining, we have the 2 women we've just had in this scene. One of them will have Miss before the name, and the other one won't, presumably a Mrs. You could, as I believe Yahtzee Croshaw did in his view, just see which one is more virginal, and state that the older woman is more likely the Mrs. and the younger woman is more likely the Miss. But we also have the wedding ring to definitively decide that. Now, this is what I was saying about the triplets. Every time you get 3 fates guessed, the game will lock them into place. And I think this makes a nice balance, because you're going to have to make a few leaps in logic, because you're going to have to do some inductive reasoning. And again, check out Matthew Matos's video, because he does a far better job of explaining it than I do. It would be unfair for you to try and guess the whole thing, because you could assume that this character is this, but maybe there's a slight bit of information that leads to someone else. And a fate that you already know, you then retroactively mess up. So having a triplet strikes a nice balance between just pulling it out of your arse and guessing, to just being able to brute force your way through. If it locked after everyone you did correct, you could just brute force all the names, as opposed to just having to go with the wind and you have no idea if you're even on the right track or not. Now the game has these little triangles above the names to suggest how easy or how difficult it will be to deduce these people's identity. And I have to say, I see what he was going for, but and I think a lot in the community who've played this game don't agree with the ratings at all. So don't take too much information for it. And this is another mechanic that I, in all honesty, kind of wish just didn't exist. Basically, people will have their portraits blurred in the sketches until the game decides that you have enough information to definitively say who their identity is. The problem is, what the game thinks is definitive information and what you might think are 2 very different things. And a lot of the times it will say that you should know this character's name, and even after repeated playthroughs, I'm thinking that's such a leap in logic to figure that out. I would leave that till later until I've guessed other people. I think it was in there to try and steer you in the right direction, but in all honesty, it usually ends up doing more harm than good. So another scene, and you'll notice with this, even though it's quite an early memory, so much is going on that it can be difficult to keep track of everything. So first of all, 3 people falling in the ship in the background, and it's very easy to miss that. And that's probably the most important bit of information you can take from this memory. Tucked away in the background is probably one of those, on a first playthrough, you'll be coming back to this and only being like, oh shit, that's there, kind of thing. And another aspect with the blurring mechanic is a lot of time you won't know who this person is, but you might be able to have a relatively good idea that, okay, he's one of the 4 mates, or oh, he's probably a top man. So you may want to put down that this is an unknown top man. But every time you try and do it, it will say you don't know who this is, and trying to guess would be unproductive. It's like, just, I don't know who it is, but I'm trying to lay some groundwork to make it easier for me. And it's annoying when the game fights you like that, and it's just one of those mechanics I wish Obra Dinn just didn't deal with. And see here, apparently we should already know who this person is. The leap in logic you have to make is quite large, I find, especially for only a 2-star deduction. So I leave this guy till later, until I at least know his job before naming him. You could name him now, but if you're watching this walkthrough, just hold on for a little bit. Now, for the longest time, I actually thought that that was some kind of more of the beast coming up, with the white around it being like the head of a white, like octopus, like shark. But that's an explosion, and this individual has also fallen off. He was climbing aboard the rigging up top, so there's a good chance he was probably a top man. But yeah, for the longest time, I would keep looking at that and just not be able to figure it out. So this person's carrying a large number of rifles. Good hint to what his role might be or who he's friends with. And we can also see here that the person who was blown up seems to have been grabbed by the Kraken-like monster. And we have another individual down here wearing the same sort of uniform who was trying to pull him back from the rope. And unfortunately the explosion's gone off and he's met a quite fiery fate, which, to be fair, I think being blown up, probably a better fate than being crushed to death by a Kraken. So we don't know who this is, but we know he is probably of some kind of Asian or Indian descent, given the I want to say turban, but I've probably got the wrong term there, because I know you have turbans, you have headscarves, but giving his head attire and the beard that he has, so we can probably narrow his nationality down a little bit. As to his exact role, well, that'll be coming up. Let's get into the next memory.
Sir, loose the cannon!
So this poor soul has just been killed by being crushed between a wooden wall and a cannon, which is it's not the worst death. I mean, hopefully if it severed the spine, it It'll go pretty quickly. But the most important thing to remember, and I'm just going to say that once now, and this applies for the remaining scenes, is to look at the numbers of the hammock. And if you have a pen and paper, it's probably going to be a good idea to write them down. It took me a long time to figure it out because it doesn't seem the most obvious thing, and it's one of those things you probably wouldn't assume that they would go through the effort of doing it. But a crew member will only sleep in the bunk that is their bunk, and their bunks have numbers assigned to them. And if you go into the crew manifest, there are numbers assigned to each member of the crew. So through these scenes, it's going to be a good idea to make a note of these numbers. 44, 45, 43, 41, 36, because that shows you that these individuals are still alive at this point. And although this memory is taking place chronologically, in the events of the voyage of the Obra Dinn, this happens quite near the end of the voyage. So any numbers of people that are still alive now, you know, have to, well, still be alive now. It seems rather redundant when I say it like that. But you know that they survive until the last 2 major memories. So it's very important information to have. And it's one of the few games which make you whack out the notepad and pen like the old days. Point blank cannon. At least the death's quick. There's actually 2 people who die here. This person who's kind of been blasted to bits, and it's a little bit more difficult, and it's going to become more obvious to see what's happened. A body's actually been blasted out of the window, so we don't find the body. It's lost to sea. So in the scene that's coming up, it's going to be a good idea to make note of who that second person is, because you're not going to get their memory. Their body's just... what remains of it is no longer on the ship. There we go. At least the game's nice enough to say what happened to these 2 individuals. So it gives you a nice hint to say, okay, 2 people have just died. What happened? And the easiest thing to do is say that they were both blasted by the beast. You can actually, instead of blaming it on the beast, if you identify who it was who accidentally lit the cannon fuse, you can blame it on him himself. And the game will accept both of them as the correct answer because they are both technically true. The only difference is that at the end of the game we'll have a summary of the payments that were paid out to which crew, and if you blame the other person, even though it's not really his fault, he gets blamed for their deaths. And so I didn't like the idea of blaming on him. 1, it's harder to do. 2, it means his family gets no compensation, which is kind of a dick move. And here is the individual that accidentally set off the fuse. As you can see, he wasn't really in a position not to set it off on the count that he was being crushed by a kraken. So it doesn't change anything in terms of the game. It doesn't change the fact that you would complete the game and it's technically correct. It doesn't have any significance other than it makes you feel like a bit of a dick, to be honest, which is what Lucas Pope does quite well. If any of you have played his previous game, Papers, Please, to do it right, you have to sometimes do things that seem morally wrong, but that's how you progress the game. And it's one of those great ways that I find Lucas can really make you think about morality without beating you over the head with morality systems like most AAA games do. Like, oh, if you do, you can clearly do the good or the bad choice, and it's like, well, no. Most of the time, life's morally grey. It's not, oh, this is definitively good, this is definitively bad. That's a very naive and childlike way of viewing it. So pretty easy to identify our artist here. There's a lot of other tidbits here that are going to really help us, particularly looking at the hammock. We have 48 and 49, and we have a scimitar next to number 36. It's very important. Also take note of who's sitting here, what hammocks they're next to, and who they're speaking to. One of them has already been grabbed by the terrible beast in a previous memory. We have a person here walking next to the third mate, so that gives us the hint that he is most likely the third mate's steward. And the unknown sailor, with the Chinese man that we know that fell over, he bunks with Wei Li, number 41. So if you go back, take a moment to look at the hammock's position. Other than that, it's just a case of seeing all the other hammocks here, probably adding to them to any other notes you have from the previous memories, and that's going to give you an idea of who's still alive at this point, because there's quite a few memories now as a gap until the next time we see some hammocks, and it's going to be very helpful for determining who's still left. And basically most of these people you're going to figure out by process of elimination at the end of the game, despite the fact that they're some of the first fates we know of in the game. It's also, I guess, important to mention, I mean, I think I've kind of alluded to it previously, but in determining who someone's identity is, not only is it useful to find what they're doing in the memories, but if you look at the sketch, that also usually gives a really big hint. Who are they standing next to? Where are they standing? What action are they performing? There's a lot that can be gleaned just from those two simple pictures.
Let me on. Over my dead body, you bloody Dane. Huh? How's that?
There's no cause for trouble, boys. Get in the boat.
Thought I'd forget. You killed my brother. What? That was an accident. The robes.
It wasn't his fault. I saw the whole thing.
Lies. I shouldn't have waited so long.
No, don't.
So this is going to allude to later on. We see a bunch of people trying to escape in a lifeboat, and if you recall in one of the previous memories, we saw 3 people being knocked overboard from a lifeboat by the terrible beast Kraken. So we know that the 3 people knocked overboard were these, which is useful because in the previous scene we couldn't actually zoom in to see who their faces are, we only saw silhouettes of them. Now this person in the boat in the back here is carrying a bunch of books, so that's going to be very helpful of trying to pinpoint out what his role was. We see one person club another person, referring to him as a bloody Dane, which means he is most likely from Denmark, and if you look at the crew manifest, there's only one individual from Denmark. As well as that, he says, "You killed my brother." So, okay, we know they're both males, so look at the crew manifest and see who has matching surnames. And there's 2, number 48, Nathan Peters, and number 60, Samuel Peters. Now, if you've been paying attention to the hammocks and you've kept notes up until this point, which is what why I told you to do it, you'll know that hammock number 60, we haven't seen that yet because he's already dead. Number 48, however, we do have, so we know the person doing the clubbing is in fact Nathan Peters, not his brother Samuel Peters. Alternatively, I mean, you could probably use it with the triplet system. If you weren't able to glean from the hammocks, there's only 2 people, so if you found 2 other fates that you were definitive of and then just kept changing the names, you could probably just brute force this person's name, but you're meant to be able to figure it out from the hammocks. And yeah, as we can see, a lot of people died in this, and there's a lot of fates unknown. There's a lot of commotion, so you're probably going to end up coming back to this a few times. In fact, I've done my best to try and say everything that's going on, but I know there's at least one thing that was missed, which I'm going to bring up soon and tell you to refer back to this. Try to keep up with it, I wasn't too great with it. But yeah, let's just fill out anyone else who we do know, or at least what fate we know. We know he was thrown overboard, so he was drowned by a terrible beast. We have Finley Dalton, the helmsman, and it's pretty safe to assume, since he was being dragged up by his foot, that he was killed by the terrible beast or the kraken. And Wei Lee, Topman, again in the previous memory we saw him fall overboard, so say that he unfortunately drowned, or maybe he swam to safety, but it's kind of unlikely given how cold the water would be. And our next 3 done quite quickly. Now there's a few memories that open up at this point, so the actual order you do them in doesn't have to be the order I'm doing them in. I did it in the Aegis order, like a few doors will be closed until a certain point.
Och no, you're cut.
Don't leave me.
Bear up, son. I'll stay with you.
Tell Pete's mother I tried my best
Aye,
to pull him back, to save him.
you tell her yourself. Brennan! Bring the surgeon's kit!
So we have our Scottish first mate here. Again, if you didn't pick up on his accent before and pick up on the previous names before, he says a little bit more so we can glean his accent. Now he says, "Tell Pete's mother that I tried." Now if you recall in the previous scene when the Kraken was attacking, there was another person who was wearing the same uniform as him. And in fact, if you look at the map of the ship, you will notice that this person has crawled into one of the midshipmen's decks. So it's pretty easy to determine that he's probably a midshipman. And the person who blew up in the previous scene, I remember mentioning there was a person that was trying to pull him back wearing the same uniform. And that's because they were both midshipmen. So now we know that the person who blew up was Midshipman Peter. And this is another midshipman. We don't know which one yet because there's 3 in total. And the first mate shouts for a Brennan to bring the surgeon's kit. Now there's only 2 other people in that scene. One of them is clambering down from the upper deck, so it's unlikely that the Scottish person would have known that he would have been there. And the other person has got his hand to his ear as if to listen out. So it's safe to assume that the person who was standing over the 2 dead bodies with his ear primed is most likely Brennan, so we can now identify him as well. So we don't know this guy's name, but we can at least say he's an unknown midshipman. We know what his role was, and it will help us narrow it down. We get quite definitive proof for the other midshipman, but not until pretty near the end of this game.
What's all this, you damn fool?
Not too much more to glean from this one, other than the fact that we know that the person, the second dead body, was killed by being clubbed around the back of the head. And again, I just want to say these sailors have got some real strength in them. They can crack skulls with just a quick crack. And we already probably had a decent idea of how this person was injured, but now we have definitive proof because there's literally a knife sticking out of his back. In fact, if you look closely, there's actually a few other knife holes in his back, hence why there's so much blood. Our first captain did also say "you're cut," so you probably could have guessed it, but now we have definitive proof. He was knifed to death, but we don't yet know who knifed him. But at least we know how he died. Now we don't know who he is, but judging by his uniform, he looks as if he's either one of the 4 mates, doesn't he? Just from his very fancy attire and hat.
Captain Campbell. You have a plan? Yes. Take ship and sail east. Trade treasure fish and shells for gold. Hey,
So we see most of what's happened here was a mutiny which led to a misunderstanding. The midshipman, in fact we have even more proof that he's a midshipman now, if the clothes weren't enough, we've also just heard him referred to as a fresh bastard. And you'll recall in the glossary that the midshipmen are usually young officers in training, so more definitive proof that he's likely a midshipman. So we have a mutiny that appears to have gone place. He stabbed someone who started shouting mutiny, and then our other person has come out to basically defend him, and in the commotion the mutineer has been shot in the head, and it looks as if Brennan's come down, not sure what's happened, and just reacted straight away by hitting him over the head. So kind of unfortunate death there. He was trying to do the right thing and ends up getting killed for it, which is kind of the fate for most of the people aboard the Obra Dinn. Like, not many of them are bad people. In fact, bar maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, they're all just trying to do their best, and well, that's life. Die regardless. As well as that, what we've happened here, we see that there's been some commotion up aboard. We see presumably the top man, from the way he moves, throwing a body overboard, and I'm about to see what's happened there, as part of the titular name of this chapter being the escape.
Let them go!
So that's pretty definitive. We already know that this is Emily Jackson, the married woman, and yeah, it's pretty obvious that he's been killed being shot with a rifle. Now, in addition to Emily Jackson, there are 3 other people on board, and you have to be careful, take care to actually properly look. We have a young man climbing off the rigging, another individual in quite fancy attire, and the young woman, Miss Jane. Again, we see him climbing over something, suggesting again he's probably a top man because of how comfortable he is aboard the different ships. And if we look down here, we can see the starts of the mutiny happening, with him coming out with the knife and presumably other members of the mutiny in the same room there.
Move quick.
Boy, you'll not take the last part.
Oh, look out.
I don't know why that last damn always makes me chuckle. So we know that the person being stabbed is most likely Paul, because we've heard one of the women, most likely this Emily Jackson, saying, "Paul, look out." And there's only one person called Paul in the ship's manifest, and that's First Mate Stuart Paul Moss, who appears to have been stabbed with a sword by the person who shot later on. Now if we go downstairs, we can see the beginnings of the mutiny happening. We see our midshipman listening in on the conversation of the mutiny taking place, and we see perhaps why they decided to talk about the mutiny, because we have here a man who's had his arm literally ripped off. Kind of a gruesome way to go.
Put me down. Let go.
Easy now. You're in a bad way.
It's the squid. Where is my Frenchman?
The squid's gone. Your mate was torn apart.
The dad. The beast is dead. How? How did you kill it?
We didn't. It left with the storm. Captain came up from the hold. Said he chased it off. You should rest.
A curse like that does not live for nothing.
So we've just heard this individual curse in German. For those of you who aren't aware, Verdammt means damn in German, and there's only a few. Also, yeah, we have our mate first mate coming out of here, so we know that this is, well, if we didn't already, we already know that. But yeah, he cursed in Verdammt, which is German for damn, and there's only a couple of German-speaking countries in the crew manifest from where people are from, and that being Austria. He also refers to his Frenchman, which helps us narrow him down. The bosun is Austrian, and the bosun's mate is a Frenchman, Charles Minor. Now, if you recall back to the very first memory, and this is what I was saying before that I didn't have time to really talk about because so much is going on, you'll see, in fact, if you go to the timestamp and go back to that, you'll see this individual, the bosun, with his arm being tangled up by the Kraken. We don't get to see it ripped off, but we can assume it was ripped off shortly afterwards. And we also see another individual wearing a checkered white and black shirt, quite often associated with French people, fighting the Kraken not too far from him. Now, we never got to see what happened to the Frenchman, but when we heard of that conversation, the beast got him. So we can say with relative certainty that Charles Minor was killed by a terrible beast. Perhaps it might be a little bit hard to put the name to the face just yet, but we do know that's the fate, and we do know that's what happened to Charles Minor. We just need to find out who Charles Minor is. You could probably guess at this point, but the game doesn't seem to think that we can, so I leave it for a little bit longer. Oh, my apologies. I do actually put that as Charles Minor. The game doesn't seem to think that we do know that. We'll see more scenes of him, so we can say definitively, because he's quite near the bosun most of the time. But there's just enough information at this point to piece it together. And as again, like I said, I honestly wish the blow mechanic just straight up wasn't in this game. It just confuses things a lot more, I find. I mean, perhaps it's a couple of times where someone becomes unblurred and just like, I didn't even see them in that scene, and you look around and you realise on another part of the ship there's more information to be seen, potentially, but again, I feel it just shouldn't be in there, or you should have the option of turning it off at the very least. So this next memory is the one that I found next, but I find a lot of people come to it a bit later. So if you're playing for this game, you may have played this in a completely different order.
Someone shoot the damn thing!
So this has got to win the award for the most unlucky death ever. This poor person, there's these weird crab-like creatures going on, and make a note of who's in here as well. Sorry, there's these weird crab-like things going on, and he tries to hide from it and ends up getting shot through a wall. I didn't think a musket would have been strong enough to pierce through the wood, but maybe it was weakened somehow. So the first two people we find in the other room was the gunner, the person with the beard who was shot, that we can identify is most likely the gunner and the gunner's mate. As well as this, if we look down the road here, we have a person hiding in here. Now this was the person who was on the ship clutching a number of books, and if you look at the map here, we see that he is in the purser's room. And the fact that he's carrying a lot of books probably suggests that he's some kind of merchant or some kind of tradesperson, and the fact that he's seen now hiding in the purser's room gives us pretty good proof of that. Now, who actually shot the individual who died there, we don't really get a clear view of it. It's a bald man. We could probably guess, but it would make more sense to view a few more memories just to get a more clear ID on him. But yeah, here we go. If we look here, we see that the two other men were in the gunner's store. So we know that the murderer and the other person there were the gunner's mate and the gunner.
I've got you. Don't move. I'll get you down.
So we can see quite clearly what's happened to this poor individual, and also we can see someone helping him, and you'll notice that the same person helps pretty much all the people when shit's gone wrong. So we can relatively safely assume that he's most likely the surgeon. I mean, pretty much from this point onwards we know he's the surgeon, but he doesn't become unblurred for quite some time for some reason. I think because you can deduce them in different orders, or whatever memories you decide to do, that they had to make a guess of a certain point of writing in the code, at which point they come unblurred. But again, my criticism of it, I'll stop going on about it now. We've seen quite definitively that the guy has been spiked through. Again, we see the purser. So we know that he was spiked by the crab creature. And for the purpose of the book, it's absolutely acceptable for, well, you have to, both the crabs and the kraken-like creature are both referred to as a terrible beast. There isn't a distinction between them. And in fact, we'll have more creatures coming up. All of them are referred to as a terrible beast. Now, we could probably guess who this person's profession is just from what he's wearing, but it's a little bit vague, so we'll leave it till later on when we get, again, more definitive proof. So exactly what's happened here is, I always find a little bit confusing, but it seems most likely that our brave midshipman, who is currently burning to death, tried to set the crab alight with some kind of fire, and in retaliation, or perhaps when it's threshing around, moved in towards the young lad and impaled him with the spikes, so he burnt along with the crab. So a brave, tragic farewell for the young man who manages to kill the monster but dies in the process, and not in the most quick or pleasant of ways. Now, before we saw a bald man who shot our first assailant here, and here we can see quite definitively the only bald man around is this person in the striped vest who we've already referred to as Charles Minor. You might seem it's a little bit too premature to tell definitively, so if you want to wait for more proof later on, that's fine. But obviously if you're listening to this commentary and if you're going through this walkthrough, then, well, you know it's Charles Minor now, but you'll see in a few scenes later on that there's more evidence to suggest him. I'm not just, the game wasn't so cruel that it just made you kind of guess that from a single conversation, although there are a few fates that it does absolutely expect you to guess just from a single conversation. So both these poor fellows meet quite an unfortunate end here. They're both being decapitated by this this crab-like creature. They're not fully decapitated, but because of the way that the claws go, the correct way would be to say that they were decapitated, not that they were clawed, not that they were spiked or anything else, but decapitated. As well as that, it's important not to get too distracted and look around. We see more of the weird crab-like creatures coming down, and if we turn right here, oh, who's this? The person of Asian or Eastern descent carrying this scimitar that we saw earlier next to bunk 36. And in fact, so we can pretty definitively decide who this is. We see another person spiked here, and in fact, if we look into the crew manifest and we look at number 36, we will find that this person, the top man Omid Gul, is the only Persian on board, and Scimitar is sword associated with that region. And we already know what happened to him because in the previous memory in the Doom we saw him fall overboard, and it was quite noticeably visible, in fact being the only one with the head wear that he has and the beard that he has. So we can safely assume that the Scimitar man is our Persian top man Omid Gul, and he fell overboard, and well, either fell overboard and drowned or was drowned by a terrible beast. I'm pretty sure both of them are accepted.
on? Stay back. It's already done for Nick. Hey. Come on, boss. No, get there. Hey, cat.
So it's a little bit difficult to discern that what happened there. So you might have to actually go through that a few times. We see here that this person who's just been spiked has attempted to throw an axe and has been swiftly killed for his actions. We also hear them say that Nick's already done for. So we know that whoever's died earlier on in this memory is someone by the name of Nick. He also states boss, and they have quite characteristically American accents. And if, especially the fact that he's using a axe, kind of suggests maybe a carpenter or something to do with wood. Now, when this first happened, trying to decide who is the boss and who is the his apprentice, I did actually assume that it would be the white man who was the boss and the black man being the apprentice, purely because of the era this is set in 1807. I know it's not as particularly nice for people with black skin as it is today, and the idea of one being able to own a business I thought would be unlikely, but it's actually kind of a red herring, I find, with the black man being the boss and the white man being his the person who works for him. And you have to listen to that dialogue, who says boss, to figure out which way round it is. And it's a nice it's a trick one, I find. As you can see, after progressing on with this game, there's much more subtle clues, and I think Lucas Pope does put a lot of effort in to make sure you're really paying attention. It's not just going to be as obvious as they have been thus far. So we see here him being impaled by a table base, and again with the previous conversation we hear them say he's already done for Nick, suggesting that Nick has already been killed. So it's most likely that the person being impaled here, this dead body, is Seaman Nicholas Botterill. As well as that, we also see a in fact the fact that we can see both the black man and his subordinate amongst all the commotion suggests that they saw it. So it is most likely that he is the victim, and we can also see the corpse of one of the Chinese top men tumbling straight down. So it's most likely he's the next death we're going to be seeing. In addition to that, sorry, I should have mentioned it. I'm struggling to keep up with everything. This was the point where we were supposed to be able to definitively identify that the person in a striped shirt is Charles Minor, because it looks as if he is leading the operation here, and he's a qualified person. He's the bosun's mate. So we now know that the person who was shot through the wood was shot by Charles Minor. We just don't know who his name is yet. And again, suggesting that there's more to this than just bad luck, that perhaps there's some kind of curse if all the weird Cthulhu-esque monsters aren't apparent already. He's just been struck by lightning, which is absurdly unlucky. As well as that, if we look at everyone here, they're all involved in the rigging. So it's safe to say that everyone here is a top man in some capacity or another, which is what I'm putting in here. They're all top men, which is also going to hopefully, I mean, the game assumes we should have already guessed it, but the person we saw being ripped in two in the Doom with all of the distinctive tattoos is going to help us really identify who this person is. Now, the way you are meant to identify him is that all these strange tattoos he's wearing are actually tattoos associated. So me trying desperately to be able to look at him. Yeah, the tattoos this individual's wearing are New Guinea tattoos. And if you look at all the different top men, there's only one person who is from New Guinea. Which I always, like, the game seems to assume this is quite an easy one to identify because of the low I don't want to say quality because it's a stylistic choice, but because of the low amount of detail you can see of the graphics, discerning that those tattoos are New Guinea tattoos and not tribal tattoos from somewhere else seems a bit difficult. Seems like quite a stretch, but that is how you're meant to identify him. And I suppose if nothing else, he is the, outside of perhaps the Persian, he's the most foreign topman, and so perhaps you could identify him that way. I don't think those kind of tattoos were as common in Britain in 1800s. Well, not just Britain, but just in general in 1800s. So again, some clues to be able to identify him. I'm not sure if it's that definitive, but that's how you're meant to guess this individual. So yeah, so interestingly enough, we're actually identifying this through the body of the crab who's being killed, not the victim here. As you'll recall earlier, this was, as I was referring to, the boss and the boss's mate. This is the boss. This is the carpenter, and if we're a little bit uncertain of their roles just yet, we will see both of these individuals in the carpenter's room in a memory coming up, which is why I don't identify them just yet. But we know that the black man is the boss and the white man is his subordinate, his mate. So we at least know the relationship there, and so when we come to the carpenter, them being in the carpenter's room later on, we will know the way round that they're meant to be. So thankfully a lot of people died there, but there was not many, in fact there's no unknown fates, so it should be quite easy for us to identify how everyone died in that particular instance. Perhaps not their identity just yet, but at least how they died.
Keep pressure here. Hold him down. What madness is this? 20 years my steward, and never a doubt on your sanity. Explain yourself.
Those ungodly beasts carry a curse! Throw them back or doom us all!
Tie him up and put him in the lazarette with those things. He may yet find his senses.
Come on.
All's fine, John. Been in worse spots, I think. Where's the rest of his leg?
Very, very nice of when people actually say their names. So, 20 years, my steward. I never had doubt on your sanity. Pretty good idea that this is the Captain Steward, Philip Dow, and so we know who has caused the accident here. Why he's decided to attack John Naples, and we also see him with rope, so it's very likely that he is the bosun because of his handling of equipment. But yes, we have Philip Dahl, who for whatever reason seems to think the ship, well, okay, it's quite obvious to think why the ship's cursed, but for whatever reason seems to assume that killing seaman John Naples here with a sword is going to in some ways rectify that, and he actually lops his leg off, and that's the leg that we find. In addition to this, we also see the again the person looking over it, and he has a surgeon's kit. So if we didn't already know by now, it's pretty good idea that this well-dressed individual is the surgeon, Henry. And it was very, very nice of the surgeon to, of course, identify the victim for us by saying, "Alright, John, been in worse spots." I'm not sure what situations he's been in, if he's been in a worse situation than having a limb amputated, but apparently a seaman's life is not the most pleasant of experiences. One of the more unfortunate deaths, crushed by falling cargo. So there's a few little bits of information we can get here. As I was mentioning earlier about these two being the carpenters, which you probably wouldn't have been able to guess just from the axe. That was probably a bit of a leap in logic for me when I'm talking. But we can see here they're both working in the carpenter's shop, and we already know their relationship because of the way that they refer to each other, as one as boss and one as subordinate. So we know that the black man carpenter is the actual carpenter, the leader, Carpenter Winston Smith, and we know that the white man with the silly facial hair is Carpenter's mate, Marcus Gibbs. In addition to this, we have this person being crushed by falling cargo. Who he is, we don't yet know, but we should find out later on.
Captain?
Hey there, what's this? Give them to me and I can fry us a solid meal, boys.
Never now. Take it slow.
What's it, gentlemen? There's a pretty shell here. Let's have a look.
No, get back.
So we have a pretty good idea of who this person is, as he mentions that he can fry a solid meal from this person. So it's reasonable to assume that he is the cook, Thomas Sefton. And this is one of the ones where the actual death's a little bit awkward. Although it looks like he's again being spiked, as most other people have, he's actually being struck by the tail, which happens to have spikes on it. So when you put down his cause of death, you have to say that he was struck by a beast's tail. Saying that he was spiked or anything else won't count. It's a little bit finicky with this one.
What the hell is going on? What do you know about these things? About the chest and your dead friends?
这是虾米？未来全部供出来，
拢是恁害啦！迄个害得较对人无顾好，是人稳死的啊！
He talk about a shell. Very dangerous.
Shell? What shell?
Again, another super unfortunate situation where one of these spikes has actually pierced two people, and the captain is quite lucky not to have been pierced himself. We see the surgeon over the bodies of what look to be the other Formosan people. Now, there's a little hint here which, again, I had no idea about, and it's only when I was reading up about it afterwards. We have a Chinese interrogator who is speaking to the Formosan individual. However, he doesn't speak Hokkien fluently. He doesn't know how to say everything, so instead he uses Mandarin for those words, which it would go over most people's heads. It certainly went over mine, but it's another little hint for you to be able to understand the dynamic behind the characters here and where they have. So we know that the Formosan dude was spiked by a terrible beast, as was the poor unfortunate soul who was spiked behind it. Now, I I would argue that it's perhaps a little bit premature to be able to know who this seaman is at this point. His name is Hamadou Diom, and how I always worked it out was by process of elimination. However, again, the game seems to assume that we do know him at this point, so I put down his name here. Personally, I would have liked to have seen more, just to be able to narrow it down further. But yeah, well, he is the Seaman Hamadou Diom, and you can probably tell. I mean, it's quite difficult to say in the sketch, but when you see him in the flashbacks, he is of a darker skin tone, so you can tell he is of a slightly different origin than the other individuals.
Ahoy!
Hell back!
The captain!
Ahoy!
Cover's aboard!
Wait! Don't shoot!
Avast!
I have treasure! I yield!
Hold your fire!
So pretty definitive here. This is was shot by the Formosan we saw previously, and it's also important when we're in this scene to look around at the other windows, because we will see this individual here who is sitting in the 4th mate's quarters if you look at the map. So we know that this is the 4th mate, which helps us narrow it down. In fact, yes, every other mate would have been identified at this point, so we know the person who's just been shot. Well, the only mate left is the 2nd mate, Edward Nichols, with the person looking out being the 4th mate, John Davies. We know that the 3rd mate has quite a large beard, Martin, and the 1st mate died in the earlier chapters as the Scottish man. So we have all 4 mates now identified moving forward. And this is me here, just trying to show through the gameplay that like he was at the 2nd mate's room when he was looking at 4th mate's room when he was looking out. So we know that this is John Davies. Now, this one I always found a little bit awkward. I wasn't too certain what was happening here, but when you look at his corpse, you can see that his right arm, the only thing that's left is a skeleton of his hand. So it's safe to assume that in opening this chest, it has burnt his hand, and as such he's most likely burnt to death. Because if you've lost your hand in such a variety that it burnt down to the skeleton, you're gonna it's you're gonna die. And he was fortunate enough to state Miss Lim. I mean, she's the only female still remaining on the ship if you go through the crew manifest, so we would have been able to figure out by process of elimination, but now we have definitive proof that the woman in the other boat is Miss Lim, the Formosan woman. So what appears to have happened here is that in the process of opening this chest, it's pacified the mermaids in some capacity, but also killed the person. Now we see here there's a knife sticking out of him, and that's important because it's very easy in all the commotion to just assume that everyone's being killed by these sirens, these mermaid type creatures, but it's not actually the case. At least one was murdered. And it's those little details you really have to pay attention to in all the commotion. Now we'll get more definitive proof of them actually being attacked later on, but if you look at the body you can see a few scratch marks across her face, which suggests quite heavily that she was clawed by a terrible beast. But if you're not too certain on this, you just wait another memory and you'll get more definitive proof.
You still breathing? Can you roll? Nichols, sir, shoot them for God's sake!
As if we needed more proof of who the mate was, we've just heard them say Nichols, which helps us out. And we also see here that this person's being stabbed in the neck by our Formosan man. So once we identify the Formosan, we now know who the murderer was. And we're certain to look around here because a lot of people are dying. Here we have our definitive proof of Miss Lin being clawed by a terrible beast. Not the kindest way to go for the poor lady, but 'tis sadly her fate. And of course our mate and see here someone else most likely being dragged down. So to remember that, and we can see our mate hiding in the boat, and generally not contributing all that much to the commotion. Now, because we know that they refer to the second mate as Nichols, it's most likely that this person is the second mate's steward, and that's how you're meant to identify them. Again, you could leave it a little bit later by process of elimination, but you are going to have to make a few jumps here and there to figure it out. And because he was the last person speaking, the fact that he referred to the second mate as Nichols rather than, you know, as second mate or anything suggests a level of familiarity.
Keep rowing!
Where is it?
There! Something there! I see it! Give us a weapon! Shoot! Mike and I! Pick up the oars and row you!
So in the little transcript we get at the start there, we hear the female Formosan, and it's nice that it's translated for us, to call the other person by his name Beng, so we know him. We know this individual has a pipe in his mouth, and try to remember that. We're going to be able to figure out his identity later because of that pipe. In addition, with all the memories that have been said here, we know that one of them aboard is the Irishman, Patrick O'Hagan, but we just don't yet know which one is the Irishman. And that's going to factor in a little bit. So we've seen this individual, he's been spiked through with well, a spear, and as such Beng is using that to cut off his binds, and this is how he's going to later stab the mate steward in the scene that we've just seen previously. A lot of people are getting killed, and a few of them are what appears to be getting dragged overboard. And it's important to remember this, not everyone's fate we're going to be able to see, but we need to be able to infer that because they were on those boats, they were dragged overboard and were either drowned by a terrible beast or were generally drowned to the sea. It was usually a safer bet to say that they were drowned by a beast instead.
Aye, sir. Checked and loaded them myself.
Good. Stay quiet and alert. If the wind picks up, we've no chance against the Obra Dinn.
休假，你玩做不？
我冇问题，但是伊来想啊，绝对袂当互伊落去水底。
那是遐个怪物出现，你绝对卖起来。
Aye, shut it up. This is strange things. About
Now the fact that one of them has just said, "Oi, shut it up," kind of suggests that that's the Irishman, the Patrick O'Hagan. And try to pay attention with some of the accents. It's a little bit awkward to tell with some of them. But this is one of those, again, you're probably going to be coming back to this after you've eliminated a lot of the other characters. In fact, these are some of the last ones you'll be figuring out, just because it is, other than the Formosans, which are relatively self-explanatory, a lot of the other identities are pretty hard to figure out. We won't know their identities for definite until we get to the bitter cold section of the memories. Now, a lot of time you can say spiked or you can say speared by a terrible beast. I think the game usually accepts either one. I don't think it matters too much. If it seems a bit longer, you can say spear rather than spike, but it's not something the game seems to be that anal about. And with the two fates that we haven't been able to see them definitively die, it's a safe bet to assume that they were both dragged overboard, and as such their bodies were lost. Again, now that we know it was Beng Sal, we can say that he was definitively knifed by him, not by one of the mermaids. And that's one of the ones which I find it's quite easy to miss in all the commotion. I definitely did put that they were just killed by the mermaids first time round. It's a really easy one to overlook.
Go back there!
Here.
Captain!
Slack the lifts and lower the boats! The whole crew will be on us!
Now I can see here that during the commotion, the second mate has kidnapped these people and the chest, and has a small group to cover him. And we see this individual being shot to try and protect him. Pay attention to the very distinctive tattoo on his right forearm of a lady. We'll see him under a hammock later on, and that's what we're going to use to identify him. Also, the fact that he's kind of climbing aboard the side to attack in the way that he is also suggests a certain level of what his profession is.
Seng Lao, you have been found guilty by self-confession of the murder of Nunzio Pasquale.
Quiet!
As captain of this ship, and by the authority of the East India Company, and thus the Crown of England, I sentence you to death by firing line. Mr. Wolf, when you are ready.
Right, sir. Ready, men.
So this is an interesting one. Although several men are shooting this individual, only one of them actually hit. And you can identify this as being our good lad Brennan again. Mr. Wolf is the one who gives the command to fire, so we can assume what his identity is, that he is the gunnery chief. In addition to this, the Chinese top man around here, you want to make sure you pay close attention to the shoes they are wearing, because it's going to become very helpful later on. And we have a lot here to help identify other people. We have the artist, we have the butcher, and we have them referring to the murder victim as a Nunzio Pasqua, the only Italian on board. We will get to see the murder shortly, and so we already know who the name of the victim is, and we can also identify the man actually being shot because the captain referred to him very specifically as Hock Seng Lao, and so we know who he is straight away, which means that we can identify all the remaining Formosans. The only other Formosan we haven't yet named we can simply figure out by process of elimination. And here we go, we have him standing next to the fourth mate, so we can safely assume that he's the fourth mate steward. The fact that he's having to stand on a block to be the same height also suggests that he's quite young. Obviously not all the stewards are young. The captain's steward has been a steward for longer than this person's been alive, but it does hint that that's a possibility. And this one we know because he's standing next to Mr. Wolf, who is the gunner. So it helps us assume he's standing next to Mr. Wolf. Chances are he's the gunner's mate. And when we were in the Soldiers of the Sea, we also saw this bearded individual with Mr. Wolf getting the guns out to attack the crab monsters with. So up until that point, we didn't know which one was the gunner and which one was the gunner's mate, but with Mr. Wolf being confirmed by the captain as given the order to fire, we can differentiate between the two. And we can also identify this person from earlier. We know from his uniform that he is a ship's steward, and we can now identify him because he is the only steward who has as of yet not been accounted for. And as you recall, I said in his memory he was shot by an unknown bald person. Well, we can pretty definitively say that the unknown bald person at this point was Charles Minor, so we can fill that in at any point whenever I remember to do it, pretty much. And of course the last Formosan here as Chio Tan. And because we can now identify the last Formosan, we now also know who it was that shot the second captain. We know who, we already knew the face, we just didn't know the name. So now we can definitively say it was Chio Tan. So yeah, a lot of identities can be figured out there. A lot to try and keep up with. And here we have the murder victim.
Hello? Who is there? Who is that? Is someone hurt? Senora Nichols, is that you? What are you doing down here? Hello, yes. All fine here. Just, sorting some things. What's your step? Here, let me help you.
Now we don't really need to think too much about the accent. We already know that the person who is murdered here is Nuncio Pasqua, and as we can see, the plot thickens. It would appear that the Formosans have brought aboard a chest which contains these shells, and presumably are worth a considerable amount. So the second captain has hatched some kind of plan with a number of other turncoats. I'm not sure that would be the best term, but a number of turncoats to steal said treasure. And in the process of trying to do so, he had to knock one of the Formosans unconscious. Nuncio Pasqua found the information, uncovered what was going on here, so the second captain has killed Nuncio Pasqua and then makes off blaming the Formosan for his death, and which leads to his unfair execution. Now fortunately, even though a lot of the identities from this point onwards are going to be kind of hard to figure out, the fact that we've already got about half of the crew locked in at this point does make it a lot easier just to figure out by process of elimination. And here you can see me going back here. It was a little bit awkward when making this walkthrough because obviously I played through it a few times, and so I had a list written down beside me, and I was trying to go through a few times to decide at what point I should know said person's identity. And of course, I knew the identities as I was doing it, and so I was doing my best to only unlock them at the point where you should be able to. But you can see I don't do this perfectly. I did try my best, but a few points I probably unlocked people a little bit prematurely or a little bit later. Hopefully this commentary helps explain some of the thought process. It's not perfect, but hopefully if there's anything I miss or there's any gaps, you can fill in the blanks yourself. I'm doing my best. So we don't actually now have too many scenes left, and yet we still have about half the crew to figure out. And it's because one of the final scenes we come across basically gives us the information to figure out a good 10 people. And it doesn't... It's one of those ones when the first time you come across a scene, doesn't look like there's much there, and it's only by comparing to other scenes and process of elimination does it come full circle.
Hit her here. One swing. Get through the skull and stone her brain. I'll cut her throat when you've done it.
Here?
Yeah. Come on before she kicks up. You all right there, sir?
Never been on a farm, Charlie?
Mind your shoes now.
So here we can quite definitively see that the person who is leading the murders, the one who actually has killed the cow, is most likely the butcher. So he's the butcher, and the fact that he's wearing that apron kind of gives it away. We also see the two other midshipmen kind of making fun of the one who seemed to have been vomiting on the wooden fencing, for not being used to it, identified as Charlie. So we know that that is the midshipman Charlie, sorry, not Charlie, Charles Hirschtick, leaving the only other midshipman available by process of elimination as Thomas Lank. In addition, we see a body being carried up, and a well-dressed moustached individual with a monkey looks to be kind of like overseeing it, leading it. We already have enough information at this point anyway, but this is just more proof that he is the surgeon, in case you did this in a different order. I don't mind me here. This is again one of the problems with trying to do this in one run, is a couple of times I will forget to put in some of the information as I learn it. And as you can see here, I'm going back to the escape just to confirm that I should know the identity of the gunner's mate, so I can definitively put that the midshipman was murdered by, or stabbed by, the gunner's mate. And making mistakes while I do it. There we go.
Well?
Same as the other fellow. Some lung disease, not consumption. Made worse by the cold.
Will it spread?
If so, we'd all have it. They must have picked it up at the Alaska house. I checked all hands just now, and everyone is healthy.
And him? What are his chances?
I gave him some laudanum. We'll see.
Now, this is the point that the game finally decides that you should conclusively know who the surgeon is. There is some information that is probably not going to be too apparent to most of you without having a bit of knowledge of the history of the place or doing a quick Google search. Lascar is a place where Indian and British colonial sailors would quite often frequent, and it seems to be that a disease has been picked up from them. So that helps identify the why that disease has been brought on. We know that the well-dressed individual is a surgeon, and the person who is with him and has been with him for quite a lot of his interactions is the surgeon's mate, the one who was decapitated in one of the previous memories. Now, there is a lot we can glean from this, but interestingly enough, not from the memory itself. And I'll show you in just a second. If you'll recall, this surgeon was one of the few characters who seemed to escape during the events of the memory escape, funnily enough. He was one of the 4 individuals who was on the lifeboat at that point. And you're thinking, okay, so they've escaped, but where have they escaped to? Do we start looking at the map and do we see what was the closest landmass? Well, not quite. It's actually something that should have been obvious to you right from the start. Let's scroll right back to the beginning. The bargain chapter will remain. So we know here that this book was sent by Henry Effens, and he wants us to return it by guaranteed post to the French Office of Affairs in Morocco. And Morocco is in Africa. So we know that the surgeon survived, and this is the book who has been sent to us by the surgeon. So we also now know that all the other people on that boat also survived and are all living in Africa. In fact, if you mess up this game and you get the bad ending, as it were, you'll get a message saying that there's, in fact, even if you get the good message, I'm pretty sure it mentions that there's 4 people who have written from Morocco. So you can work out without having to do that, but it's one of those that if you do mess it up and you end up coming to the end of the game, it gives you a little hint and a little nudge in the right direction. Right, so this is going to be a fun one to try and do. The next one is the... It seemed so innocuous when I first played through it, but the next one is the most important scene because it lets you identify so many people. And I'm going to try and see if I can get through everything. Right, so there is a lot to go through in this chapter. I do spend quite a while on it, so I'm going to do my best not to rush through it. So, Solomon Said, we know that this person is Solomon, mostly because he's, well, he's called Said. But, most importantly, if you look at the number on his hammock, you will see that the number on the hammock corresponds to the number on the ship's manifest, number 54, and this is the first piece of it. Well, this is the first time you get to know for definitive that the numbers on the hammock correspond to the people on the manifest. Now, in addition to this, we heard these gentlemen speaking in Russian, and oh, hello, what's this? Is that a pipe? The same pipe that one of them was smoking during the unholy, not the unholy captives, the calling chapter, which I said to pay attention for later. That's going to help us identify him. So let's go through this. There's 22 people present in this memory. So the very first one we have Solomon Said. I mean, he's referred to by name, and he's in hammock number 54. So plenty of evidence to be able to figure him out. Now, we have an arm dangling from the hammock with a very distinctive tattoo of a lady. And as you'll recall, in the start, or rather at the end well, start chronologically, end from the way we saw it, of the calling. We saw a man shot by the second mate with the same tattoo on him. And as such, we can identify Timothy Buteman as the victim because he is lying in the hammock, which corresponds to his number, and the tattoo on his arm is quite distinctive. So excellent, we got 3 more done. Next we're going to move on to the other Indian gentleman here. Okay, so let's start having a look at the numbers here. Oh, hello, number 51. Okay, so we know that this is number 51. This is Renford Rajub, who also succumbed to tragic illness. We don't have the number for this dude, but we do have 53. And as the only man not in the bunk, we know that this person must be number 53. William Wasim, who is also from India. And it makes sense that they all, you know, would bunk together. So the only Indian left, by process of elimination, is Abraham Akbar. So, yep, 3 more fates figured out, or because, well, it makes sense, doesn't it? If they're all from India, chances are they're going to be friends, so it's going to make sense that they're all going to bunk together. And unfortunately, 2 of them succumbed to this Lascar illness originated from the Lascar. So, bam, another 3 done. And we're about 3/4 of the way through identifying everyone now. They're making very large headways with it. Now, the next thing to do is go over to the people playing some kind of card game. Now we know who one. We know that Leonid Volkov was shot by Emily Jackson, and I hope you recall paying attention to all of the hammocks, because by the time of him being shot, his is the only Russian hammock left hanging at that point. Both of his compatriots have perished already, so we know that this is number 45 topman Leonid Volkov. And we can identify the other one by the pipe that he was smoking during the unholy captive. Sorry, I keep getting it wrong. The cooling. During the cooling. Because the pipe is next to the hammock, and then we can identify the last remaining Russian as the only one left by process of elimination. And now here is where I realised that, well, actually no, I still don't realise that I haven't put down that he was clubbed rather than knifed. But we can now identify him again. I hope you kept notes of the hammocks that were in the earlier memories. If not, you'll have to go back and replay them. But we now know that he is the only top man left. So he must be this individual. He must be Lewis Walker. And we need to fill in a few little extra bits. The surgeon's mate here, which probably should have put down earlier, but must have forgotten. I think this is when I realise that I've made a mistake with the clubbing and the knifing incident. So yep, we know this is Patrick O'Hagan from the incident when they were at sea again. O'Hagan, you still breathing? Can you row? So we've managed to figure him out by process of elimination. And another 3 gone. We've not got many left. Now, possibly the most difficult, most bullshit, and section that people mess up the most is the 3 almost identical Chinese topmen. And I'm pretty sure in Yahtzee's own review, he said he couldn't figure out how to do this, and he pretty much just figured it out by brute forcing it by switching them around, and it was the only time that he did something like that. The way you are meant to identify them is kind of ridiculous. You need to recall from the previous memory the sacrifice at sea, not sacrifice at sea, justice at sea win, and you can kind of look at it from the sketch, but it's good to try and remember. They are wearing different shoes. Now, if you match up the shoes that they're wearing, I mean, you can kind of use the picture here as a bit of a reference, but if you match up the shoes they are wearing to the hammocks they're sleeping in, because you can only see their feet, this is how you are meant to differentiate between the 3 Chinese men. It's probably the 3 most difficult one. I know it's the 3 that most people seem to get stuck on the most, but this is how you are meant to figure it out. And I'm fairly certain this is the point where I start to realise I've made a few little errors, and I'm just furiously scrubbing through them because I don't want to do the whole walkthrough again, trying to figure out what's gone wrong. And it takes me a little while to realise that I've done one of the very first ones incorrect by saying that he got knifed. Interesting tidbit, actually. When I was recording this, it didn't save it in all one continuous file. Every time a new memory started or anything like that, it would save them as individual files, which is also why whenever we go into one of the memories, it doesn't play the full tune as it goes in. For some reason, my recording software, whenever it goes completely black, assumes that nothing's being recorded and just cuts that section out. It's very strange. This also meant that all of the files I got wasn't in order, and it took fucking hours to put it all back into place. I had like 130 individual like clips or somewhere around that ball figure. Yes, we've identified most of them, and now it's just, fortunately, we don't have too many left, and it's kind of just going through and identifying the last remaining ones by process of elimination. Admittedly, I do make a couple of mistakes here. I was very conscious of the fact that I was trying to do it quickly without just messing around, because especially in my walkthroughs you won't have this kind of commentary over it, and because I was rushing so much, I ended up making a few little silly mistakes here and there. I didn't look properly at the shoes and the number, and so I put the wrong name down first, and then I'm looking through my notes trying to figure out what's gone on. I don't want to redo this whole 2+ hour walkthrough, what's happened, and I do apologize for that. I mean, hopefully you can still kind of make sense of it all. It's not as professional as I would have liked it, but I had gone through this multiple times at this point, and it was one of those where I knew pretty much all of it inside out, but I wasn't quite doing the gameplay right, and I was, in all honesty, just a bit burnt out, and so I was like, fuck it, this is good enough. So yeah, just going through here and see who else we can identify pretty much by process of elimination, because we know a lot of them now. Just from like their roles that they play, and we know obviously it can't be one of the Peters because he wasn't killed by an accident, and he was killed much later in the ship's voyage than it would have been if he was the brother who was killed by an accident. So we know number 60 is still to remain. And as I recall, aboard the Obra Dinn, there is one memory remaining before we get to the epilogue section. So even though only 3 people actually died in the bitter cold, it has given us the information to identify about 10 to 15 people. So it's an insanely important chapter. Now this one is certainly threw me through a wee bit of a loop. It seems as though because you get two scenes which are very similar to each other, and it always seemed quite strange that it played out. What happened is that aboard the Obra Dinn there was a stowaway aboard one of the barrels who was killed in this accident. And in actual fact, I think it's insinuating that the fact that the ropes gave way and the fact that this accident happened at all is because they didn't anticipate the extra weight and perhaps them moving around inside the barrel. So a stowaway who isn't on the ship's manifest, so thankfully we don't need to identify him. It's just a stowaway. Was killed aboard. So it's actually 61 souls aboard the Obra Dinn, of which 57 perish. And now, if you'll recall, in one of the earlier scenes, there were 3 individuals trying to make a way on a lifeboat that was capsized by the terrible beast. And in the ensuing commotion, or rather the preceding commotion leading up to that event, one of the people on board ended up killing the person in the top left there, the bloody Dane, the person from Denmark, for killing his brother. And they state that it was an accident, the rope, and we can see here that the Dane is looking down, so presumably he's the one that gets blamed from it, and it does look as if a rope has given way, crushing this person. So we already know that someone died during an accident, and we know it has to be one of the brothers, and the only brother left is the only other Peters that we still have. So this should be the final person we need to decide. And now we have literally every information we need to solve this, so it's just a case of going through and seeing what we've missed or what mistakes that may be. And we have here is the last Chinese man. It's the last Chinese man from the shoes that I should have identified already. There's actually a strange glitch that happens here. If you solve all of the fates before exiting the memory, you get this weird glitch for some reason when the rower is speaking to you. I'm not sure why that is. I mentioned it in my my Steam review. It doesn't really affect the gameplay at all. It's just a weird thing that happens for whatever reason. Maybe some kind of coding error. I'm not certain. But yeah, you get stuck on this scene as the cutscene plays, and all you have to do is just press tab and go out of it, and it plays just fine. Unfortunately, we missed the cutscene where the person rowing states that a storm's coming, so we have to get off. If you haven't identified everyone at this point, that cutscene will play once you've done all the memories, and there is no time limit. Like, you can stay on the ship as long as you want. Like, there is no time limit, but it's just a narrative measure. I mean, it starts raining. It's just a narrative way of saying once you leave the Obra Dinn, you will not return. That's it. This ship gets sunk. So take one last look at the Obra Dinn as we part for the final time. Brings a tear to one's eye.
We should go.
And again, that's just a way of saying this is the point of no return. So only let these circles go all the way in if you are 100% certain.
Finally. Sit down so you don't fall out.
And here we get to read the report of what we've done. And it will show the claimants that was paid out for each individual. For the most part, it doesn't seem to really matter, but there are a few things that can change, such as the individual, whether you say he was blasted by a cannon or by a terrible beast. And that can change the payout. You will see that some of the payouts don't quite match up, and I do feel sorry for a few of them who get fined. Like, shit was so fucked that like, okay, the second mate for doing the for kidnapping and the murdering, okay, that's fair enough, he was an arsehole, but most of the other people were just struggling to deal with it, and yeah, quite a few of them get fined. I think Brennan in particular gets fined, and I always quite liked him. From the few bits I had, he seemed like a good dude. But I mean, most of them at least get a claimant, and like £50 or £30 back in 1807 was pretty fucking significant for your average poor person. Yeah, Nuncio Pasquale, no claim made. Lanlim, no claim made, probably because they're of a Formosan descent and weren't even aware that claims could be made. I'm pretty sure you find that with all of the Formosans, except for Chiotan for shooting the second person gets yeah. I mean, at least most of them get kind of what they deserve for the most part, but a few of them are a bit unfortunate. Davy James, 4th Mate Stewart, abandoned to Africa. And I imagine this is perhaps some kind of meta commentary on the nature of insurance and how they will try almost anything to get out of it. There's actually an achievement you can get called Captain Did It, where you just blame everything on the captain. Everyone got killed by the captain, and that's your achievement. That's an interesting one. Yeah, a lot of the people who attempted the mutiny at the end towards the captain, I feel as if a lot of them were doing it because they've been attacked by, so much shit. I mean, there's basically everyone's dead. There's like 5 people left on a ship at this point, and they don't believe that the shells have been thrown overboard because the shells seem to attract these creatures, and they've gone to throw a couple of shells overboard, but there was one left that they didn't know about, and that's why the attacks continued. So they've gone to attack the captain because they're fearing for their lives, pretty much. In their mind, they were doing what they need to do to survive, and yet they get charged with mutiny and get fined for it, or their estate rather gets fined. Yeah, Mr. Brennan there, estate fined £50. It's yeah, it's kind of sucky, but as were the times for 1807. All of it sucked. That's that case wrapped up. Or so we would think. There's still a few things unidentified, isn't there?
Right, well, get yourself home then. And tell Martha I said hello.
Can you believe it? A package at this hour? Oh, the thing smells just dreadful. Better you don't open it inside. I'll be turning in. Tea's in the kitchen if you need more.
Chief Inspector, I write to you with the unfortunate news that Dr. Evans has passed away. He succumbed to his illness shortly after receiving your package. He was very pleased with your correspondence and asks that his gratitude be expressed by returning the book to you, along with the means to complete it. Do not write back. So, along with the book, we are given a monkey's hand. His tale belongs to you now. Please finish it. Henry Evans. So let's take the monkey paw out. Continue with one last memory.
There you are. Collect your things. Where's the key? To that door. Gone. Yeah. There's no time. We need to go.
Right.
What are you up to?
And the surgeon's poor monkey friend has just been killed. And it's only with the death of this monkey that you'd be able to piece together everything that happens in this final chapter to fully understand the events and why everything happened and why they eventually stopped as well. As well as the fates of the last remaining people aboard who we weren't able to decide. Was like that? A friendly but not entirely pleasant monkey was sacrificed for the truth.
A third shell. The captain didn't toss them all. Leave it. Help me lift it. Stop! Why? Well, set you free. Give it the shell. Do it. Hoist it out. To the main deck. Throw it over. Lock the door when you leave. Get the tail, boy. In return, the ship.
the Obra Dinn. See you at home.
So quite a noble sacrifice in many ways. The mermaids seem to have some kind of connection with these shells. They seem to have some kind of magical powers. You can see also Paul Moss here, the person who was stabbed trying to escape. It seems as though all the creatures are attacking because of these shells, and the captain believed that he had tossed 2 of them over at some point earlier after the events of Soldiers of the Sea, and he believed that would stop it, that the curse would stop, especially after Philip Dahl hacked away one of the crew members' legs. But not all of the shells were thrown, and the fact that mermaids were still kept after the events of the calling. So the 3rd mate tried to sort it all out and was spiked for his trouble.
I'll kill every last one of you monsters. Withdraw the Kraken, or I will kill you all!
So as we see, the events of this chapter are happening alongside the events of the Doom, as opposed to all the other memories which tend to happen either before or afterwards. So it's around this time that the giant beast comes to attack, and he doesn't know what's going on. He just knows that the mermaids are there, and so the captain goes in to try and get him to withdraw it with the only way he knows how, which is with threats. And if you recall, in one of the earlier scenes, Abigail says, "Where is the captain? Where is my husband?" And Martin says he's down below deck, and this is where he was during those events.
Call it off, damn you! This is your Kraken! You brought it here! Send it back!
And just pretty much continuing on. I mean, it's got to the point now that there's not a huge amount of information to glean. It's mostly just letting the story play out and what men will do in such tragic situations. I find it's very... I mean, I'll probably ruin it in my commentary, but that's what the other video's for. It's very tragic, and I think the music only helps point that out, of just the bleakness of the situation. Very somber storytelling.
What's this? Quicksilver.
So as we can see from when the chest's been opened before, every time it's opened, it seems that a searing flame is unleashed, a flame that can also subdue the mermaids. And the Captain Stewart has gone to, after being locked up in here, after his slightly mad ramblings and leg retrieval of crewmates, he's locked up in here and goes to look in the chest and is burnt to death as a result. And with all of that, we now know the fates of the last 2 remaining people aboard. And we have all the information to piece together the entire fate of the Obra Dinn. Use the pocket watch to determine the identity and fate of everyone aboard. Complete each chapter accurately and return the book by guaranteed post to the French Office of Affairs in Morocco. The bargain chapter will remain unknown to you until now. So at first the ship sails aboard. And in loose cargo, Samuel Peters is crushed by falling cargo. In addition, an unidentified stowaway expecting free passage and eventual freedom was instead crushed inside a falling barrel. A bitter cold. On the gun deck, Solomon Said, a seaman, succumbed to a tragic illness. And in the surgeon's room, Renfred Rajoub also succumbed to a tragic illness. Later on, a large cow was slaughtered for its meat. Next, there was a murder. Nuncio Pascual, one of the passengers, was knifed by Edward Nichols, the second mate. On the main deck, Hock Seng Lao was shot with a gun by Henry Brennan during an execution for the murder of Nuncio Pascual. Timothy Buton, a top man, was shot with a gun by Edward Nichols, the second mate. And these individuals sailed away from the ship. Lee Hong, one of the top men, was speared by a terrible beast. Patrick O'Hagan, the Irish seaman, was speared by a terrible beast on the open sea. Samuel Galligan, second mate steward, was knifed by It Beng Xiao, one of the passengers. Bun Lan Lim, a passenger of foreign descent, was clawed by a terrible beast. It Beng Xiao, one of the passengers, burned to death. Edward Nichols, second mate, was shot with a gun by Chio Tan, one of the passengers. And 2 wayward souls disappeared during the events of this chapter. Alex Toporov and Alarkus Nikoshin were both drowned by terrible beasts. After the ship came ashore with the unholy captives, Chio Tan and Hamadou Diom were both spiked by a terrible beast. Thomas Sefton, the ship's cook, was struck dead by a beast's tail. William Wasim, one of the seamen, fell down the stairs to his death. John Naples, one of the seamen, was killed with a sword by Philip Dahl, the captain's steward. Later on, the ship was attacked during the events of Soldiers of the Sea. Huang Li, one of the top men, was electrocuted performing his duties. Nicholas Botterill, one of the top men, was spiked by a terrible beast on the main deck. Marcus Gibbs, the carpenter's mate, was spiked by a terrible beast. James Wallace and Ji Zhang were both decapitated by a terrible beast. Charles Hirschtick, one of the midshipmen, burned to death fighting them. Emil O'Farrell, the butcher, was spiked by a terrible beast. Jung Saf, ship's steward, was shot with a gun by Charles Minor, bosun's mate, and Winston Smith, the carpenter, was again spiked by a terrible beast. The hideous monster perished simultaneously with the brave individual. During the events of the Doom, Lars Lind, one of the seamen, was clubbed by Nathan Peters. Edward Spratt, one of the artists, was crushed by a terrible beast. Abraham Akbar was crushed by a loose cannon. and in the commotion, both Christian Wolfe and George Shirley were blasted with the cannon caused by a terrible beast. Roderick Anderson, third mate steward, was also crushed by a loose cannon. Peter Milroy, one of the midshipmen, was blasted by an explosion. Mabber, one of the topmen, was torn apart by a terrible beast. Abigail Hoskett Witterall, one of the passengers, was crushed by falling rigging. 7 wayward souls disappeared. Omid Goll and fell overboard whilst Nathan Peters was drowned. Alexander Booth, Duncan Mackay were drowned. Wei Lee fell overboard. Finley Dalton and Charles Minor were killed by a terrible beast. In the lazarette during these events, Philip Dahl, the captain's steward, burned to death. And unholy creatures' defiant shrieks were greeted with a fatal bullet. A captured beast fought against its jailer and was speared for the trouble. Martin Perrott, the third mate, was spiked by a terrible beast. In the lazarette, a friendly but not entirely pleasant monkey companion was sacrificed in the pursuit of knowledge. During the events of the escape, Alfred Cleston, the bosun, succumbed to his wounds whilst fighting the terrible beast. Paul Moss, the first mate steward, was killed with a sword by Leonard Volkov, who was then shot with a gun by passenger Emily Jackson. Olas Waita, gunner's mate, was shot with a gun by John Davies, the fourth mate, who in return was clubbed by Henry Brennan, the seaman. Thomas Lank, the midshipman, was knifed by Olas Waiter, the gunner's mate. And 4 wayward souls disappeared. Emily Jackson, Miss Jane Bird, Davy Janes and Henry Evans all escaped the Obra Dinn and live in Africa, apart from Henry Evans, who has died quite recently. William Hoscott, the first mate, was shot with a gun by Captain Robert Witterall. Henry Brennan was knifed by Captain Robert Witterall. Lewis Walker, the topman, was clubbed by Captain Robert Witterall. And Captain Robert Witterall, being the last remaining member aboard the Obra Dinn, shot himself. That concludes all the fates of the Obra Dinn. And with that, the end of the game. The good ending as well. So, I don't know how much came through from my voice, but this is a game I love. It's one of those ones, even just watching through it again and doing this commentary, just the combination of the music, the settings, everything, it really brings you into this tragic tale. And a phenomenal game. For my dad. I hadn't noticed that before. That's sweet. Yeah, it's brilliant. It's an interactive story, and it's amazing because there isn't much dialogue there. There's precious little animation most of the time. It's just still frames, still 3D images, and it's a great way for. I know one of my friends is trying to make his own game at the moment, and I've said to him that the best thing to do is make a great. It's a story-driven game, is to make a great story. You know, I know AAA will spend so much money on making great graphics, and you see it in films as well, great effects, and they forget the most important aspect: a story at the heart of it. And this game, it's very limited. It's a tiny team. I mean, Lucas Pope, mostly the help he got was just when it came to dealing with the different characters' voices and getting some knowledge on different languages and that kind of thing. But it's mostly one person. And he didn't say, right, I'm limited, I'm going to try and make some massive game, because I'm not going to be able to. I don't have the resources. And it's the same when you look at a lot of old movies. limitation breeds a certain level of ingenuity. He knew he was limited, and he, rather than see that as a handicap, he built a game around it. He thought outside the box, and what you have is quite a simplistic game, but it's genius. It's so intelligent. Not perfect, because no game is, but for a game made mostly by one person and helped by such a small team, so many people are giving it Game of the Year. It's like I don't think it's ever going to reach quite the same heights of Undertale, because it is a niche game. I know Undertale is, but this is a more niche game. It appeals to the people, those of us who like to spend a lot of time and like to have a game where you can actually whack out a notepad and pen, because there's just not enough of those anymore. So yeah, I hope my commentary has helped explain how you find out some of these fates a little bit better. I do realise my commentary probably wasn't the best, and my walkthrough in the first place probably wasn't the greatest thing either, but hopefully you got a little bit of help there, a little bit of insight, and if ever there was something in the other walkthrough that you weren't quite gleaning, maybe through all of my general ramblings you found something in there that helped point you in the right direction. It's a fantastic game, so even if it's not your sort of thing, if you have the money, go out and support them, because small indie devs need that support and it deserves it.